Welcome to UO Today. I'm Paul Peppis, Interim Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. Our guest today is Lan Samantha Chang, the fiction writer. She's a professor of English at the University of Iowa and director of the Iowa Writers Workshop. Her works include the collection of short fiction Hunger, a Novella and Stories, and two novels, Inheritance and All is Forgotten, Nothing is Lost. Chang gave a lecture titled Narrative Frame, Portal of the Past on April 3rd, 2014, and a reading the following day. Her talk was part of the Comparative Literature Department's Nomad Mentorship Program. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
It's great to be here.
Child of Chinese immigrants, you were born and raised in, of all places, Appleton, Wisconsin. How did you come to be a writer in that context?
Well, writers are generally people who've experienced being an outsider, and being a child of Chinese immigrants in my town, in the era in which I was raised, was a really unusual circumstance. There were 3 Chinese families in our town and a total of 6 children, well, 7 children, 4 of them from our family. So I was sort of flabbergasted and confused by the dominant culture in our town because my parents were fairly recently arrived from China and we were such a tight-knit family. I remember going to school and sort of taking notes in my head as if it were an anthropology project. I was baffled by a lot of what I saw. That could be my nature of simply being confused, but as it turned out, I carried that habit of making observations into my adult life, and it's been an interesting experience to watch how much more diverse not only my hometown has grown, but the entire U.S. Profile, and to remember what it was like in those days. If I had grown up now in the town where I'm currently living, I don't know if I would have felt particularly left out of the mix.
Interesting. So you've already begun talking about this, but maybe you could say a little bit more about how did growing up in the Midwest affect your relationship to your Chinese heritage?
I don't know. You know, for me, part of my relationship to my Chinese heritage was formed because I grew up in the Midwest and there were hardly any other Chinese people where we were. And part of it was formed by the fact that I grew up during the era when the mainland China was cut off from the Western world. So they were probably associating with North Korea and, Russia a little bit, but not with the U.S. And so my father's entire extended family was in mainland China, and it was as if they were swallowed up. We never talked about them, well, maybe once or twice. We certainly never saw them or corresponded with them. We had no idea what had happened to them. And there was a very strange feeling that the past was sealed away and that we had no access to it. That, I think, affected the way I thought about China. It made China into a very, very powerful place for me when I was growing up. It was the place where the secrets were buried. And so I think that my Chinese heritage was one of a person who knew she was Chinese, knew that she came from a Chinese family, but had no idea what that meant.
So the first 2 books, they both are books that are related to, tell stories that are related to your Chinese heritage. So was that a way for you to recover a connection to China, writing those books? Is that part of what was going on there?
My first book was primarily set in the U.S., and it was primarily about young Asian American women. I mean, a lot of the characters were women, so narrated by these women. Talking about, I think when I think about it now, it seems to me to be sort of accounting for their heritage and the separation, your basic separation from your parents, which in this country, for an Asian person at that time, was rather fraught because there's a clash of cultures. In China at the time, the best way a child could be was filial to their parents and with their parents and close to their parents at all times. And in this culture, there's a sense of separation and individuation. growing up and becoming your own person, making your own decisions, being independent from your parents. And that conflict and struggle was sort of programmed into me when I was born, because I was by nature a kind of independent person. And so I think that's what my first book is really about. I think it's about growing up. And I like that book a lot, and I still feel close to it. But I think because sort of I've gone through this process with my parents, it's, not what I'd be working on now. The second book, a novel, was really something that I'd wanted to write probably for as long as I knew what I was planning to do, as planning to become a writer. And it's really kind of my effort to make sense of what might have been taking place in China before I was born. The things that my parents wouldn't tell me. And I think in that way, that book was a direct effort to connect to my heritage. I studied Chinese and East Asian studies for 4 years in college. And, I graduated with more background than I'd ever had before. Started to ask my parents some questions. At that point, China was sort of coming out of the deep freeze, and my parents, I think, were feeling less isolated, more willing to talk about it, more willing to connect. So I was able to do some research, and I was also able to go to China and do some research, and so I wrote that book. It's a book I couldn't have written now. A lot of people who I talked to do research for the book are dead. I was trying to write about a specific historical period, a long one, comprised of many tumultuous events, but a period that's retreating into the past. And so I'm really glad, actually, that I wrote and finished that book. It was torture. It was a really hard project
for
me.
Major work. So your most recent book, All Is Forgotten, Nothing Is Lost, departs significantly from the last novel. What inspired you to write a novel about two white male poets?
Oh, well, when I was 26, I left my sort of previous plans in life behind and went to study fiction writing at the Iowa Writers Workshop, which is something that I'd wanted to do since I was, an adolescent. I mean, I'd heard about Iowa as an adolescent, if you can believe it. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I thought it would be like a home. And it did turn out to be a home. It's not an easy place to be a student, but it was definitely a place where I felt that for the first time I was able to really do what I wanted to do and to think about what I wanted to think about and be the person I wanted to be and be a writer, try to be a writer. It was a real learning experience for me. And after that, I went to the Stanford program and did a Stegner Fellowship, which was also an experience for which I'm very grateful because I received support for 2 years. And, it's very rare for a young writer to get so much encouragement. And so I'm grateful, and I learned a lot there. I did some teaching at Stanford, and then I started sort of moving around while I was writing Inheritance from one place to another. I went from one creative writing center to another on fellowships. I taught for a while. I went to colonies, and I just encountered so many writers and their teachers or mentors, which is something that began to fascinate me more and more as I became a teacher. I'm really interested in the relationships between students and their mentors. I'm really interested in the way that people change as they think about their work, from how they think about it when they're young to the way they think about it when they're older. And that can be illustrated in relationships between teachers and their mentors. And I did not sit down to write this book as a project. All is Forgotten, Nothing is Lost. I received a Guggenheim Fellowship to write a set of 3 novellas about Asian Americans living in an Asian American family living in the Midwest. And when I sat down to write the novella, I wasn't interested in it. I mean, I had a draft of one and some other beginnings of others, and I wasn't interested. I kept thinking about a project that I had started really just in a couple of weeks one summer. That was about some poets. I'd wanted to write about poets, but I'd set it aside because I thought I should be doing something more along the lines of what I should be doing or what I had done. And I couldn't stop thinking about this. And here I had a year off from my job to write, 2 semesters off to write, and I felt like I was wasting my time thinking about this unnecessary project. I told my husband, who's a painter, and he said, "Why don't you just set aside 1 month to work on the Poets Project?" And I thought, that sounds totally doable. I'll just take 1 month and I'll work on it, and then I'll go do something else. So I did, and at the end of that month, I thought, I want 1 more month. Then at the end of that month, I thought, okay, 1 more month. And then I got 3 weeks at a colony in Wyoming with my husband and my infant daughter. You know, at that point, we were all sort of a unit for various reasons. And we all went and lived in a composer's house and took turns taking care of her. And he would paint when I was taking care of her, and I would write when he was taking care of her. And I finished a draft of this book. I mean, it came out of me so easily, and it was something I was so interested in, and it had nothing to do with anything I'd written. But it had very much to do with the 15 years that I'd spent sort of apprenticing for something, apprenticing to be a grown-up writer, which, you know, I still don't really see myself as. You learned so much. So I couldn't resist putting like almost everything I'd learned at that point into the book.
So how about reading a little bit of it for us?
Sure. So in this book, I should say there's 2 poets, 2 guys who are really good friends in graduate school, and they both have a teacher named Miranda Sturgis. So I'll start at the beginning of the book with this description of Miranda. Miranda Sturgis was an exceptional poet. Among the school's distinguished faculty, she was the brightest star, and graduate students fought to gain admission to her seminars. It was 1986, and the most fervent feared they had missed the age of poetry, that they were born into the era of its decline. To Miranda and the school, they came in defiance of that decline, or, at the very least, to sit for 2 years in the circle of her radiance. They yearned to know her mind and hoped to earn her blessing as they set forth on an uncertain path. But Miranda was critical of their work and dismissive of their hopes. She rarely offered praise. She discussed their poems ruthlessly, as if they were not in the room. Of the students in her classes, almost none escaped unaltered or unscathed, and some stopped writing altogether. Such was her teaching that the students at the school had invented a special nickname for her critiques. They were called bludgeonings, as in, he's drunk, he's just been bludgeoned. Out in the world, the small, passionate world of poetry, Miranda maintained a sterling reputation as a teacher. There was learning and acuity in her body of work, the shimmering debut, the rigorous and ambitious second book, the third book, shortlisted for several major national prizes. She was considered an accurate and influential judge of talent. It was rumored that she sometimes took a special interest in the career of a young poet, and that her protégés began with a vital advantage. And so, despite the bludgeonings, despite confusion and hurt feelings, the students kept lining up to take her classes. They concealed their discouragement from their families, most of whom did not read poetry, from the school, of whose faculty she was by no means the worst instructor, and from Miranda herself, because they sensed, with the visceral knowledge of neglected children, that if they were to complain to her, she would not notice. Instead, they watched her keenly. They studied how she dressed and how she did her hair. They puzzled over the hesitant yet determined way she gestured as she spoke. They tried to copy these habits as if they could learn to be Miranda, could transform their own young hands, grasping their pens, into her delicate, reluctant hands. So what happens is Miranda does take a special interest in the career of a young poet, and it's Roman who's the protagonist of this book. And a lot of the book is about the fallout from that special interest that she takes in him. And it's also the fallout, I think, it's a fallout of the way that Roman approaches his career as a young man. He's very ambitious, kind of aggressive. He's very competitive. He's very focused. He cuts out everything else from his life and has this little, like, fortune cookie-sized sticker on his computer that says all that matters is the work. And he succeeds, ultimately, in reaching his goals to some extent. At least it appears that he's reached them, because he receives, a major prize, and he has a job teaching at a college. And really what the book is about is it's about, I think, what he comes to learn about himself and about poetry over the course of his life into middle age, when, of course, it's too late to redo any of the things that he then wishes that he could have done differently. But he stays friends with this guy from grad school named Bernard, who's a very different kind of fellow, like a dreamer, very impractical, ambitious, but not in a worldly way, and very spiritual. So I can also read from later in the book. What happens is the book takes place over a period of years, as I was saying, and one of the big jumps is between the first section of the book, which takes place mostly in graduate school, and then afterward, when Roman is now teaching and settled with one of his classmates, Lucy, and they're sort of living fairly happily in Nebraska with their child, Avery. And then Bernard, who's living in this sort of rent control apartment in Manhattan, gets kicked out of his apartment temporarily because he's not actually supposed to be living in the apartment. The rent control person has to take possession of it long enough to throw the whatever off their scent. Mm-hmm. And so he goes to live with Roman and Lucy for like a fairly long period of time. And this is the moment when he and Roman reunite after a long, number of years. I should say they're in Nebraska. Did I say that?
You did.
So he has to come all the way out to Nebraska on the bus. Bernard turned down Lucy's offer of a plane ticket and took the bus. He would be making intermediary stops in the Midwest, he wrote, and a bus ride made more sense. He would be traveling for a week. For the length of that week, with Avery away at camp, no poetry, nothing to do but help Lucy prepare the attic room, Roman imagined Bernard seated, reading, dozing, looking out the window. He remembered taking the bus across the country when he was young and unsettled, the stale air, the effort of redoubling his concentration on a book or no book, the 100 tiny stops at 100 rest stations, waking up from a miserable night of awkward dozing as the bus slowed into a small hamburger stand in verdant, exotic fields of corn and soybeans, stepping stiffly from the bus into the fragile, indeterminate atmosphere of a new place. On the evening Bernard was to arrive, Roman left for the bus depot a few minutes early. He drove slowly with the window down, savoring, as if encountering it as a stranger, the delicate heat of a late summer afternoon, with the fierce and fragile light warming the lingering humidity. The faint sound of drums floated through the air. The university marching band had begun its practice for the year, and for the length of the autumn, depending upon the direction of the wind, the blood of everyone in the vicinity of the stadium was stirred by the steady rapping of snares. Reaching the depot, he searched the stream of passengers that emerged, mostly students, tousled from their hours on the bus, blinking as they waited for their overstuffed duffel bags. Amid the stream of students, Bernard appeared on the top step. It was with a jolt of emotion that Roman recognized his friend, the slight stooped frame, the faintly beaky profile, which had only become more pronounced, more Bernard-like over the years. Bernard followed the other passengers to the pavement and stood looking about him. His eyes were bright, his cheeks flushed and still hairless, as Roman had expected. He carried a worn brown valise, as Roman had also expected, but instead of a tie, he wore his shirt open at the neck, revealing a small gold cross. He examined Roman minutely, then he smiled. It was the same radiant smile, with its combination of delight and intelligent appraisal. "It's been years," he said. "It's marvelous to see you, Roman." But what did Bernard truly make of him, Roman wondered. Years older, pounds heavier, and what did Bernard make of this shabby bus depot, glazed in the pale gold light of an early autumn afternoon? For Roman was troubled by, unprepared for, the changes in Bernard. Poverty in a young man is thoughtless, presumably a visitor, and worn lightly. With age, it begins to mark the face. Roman had not expected the lines about Bernard's nose and mouth, the features almost undernourished, decidedly eccentric. Moreover, it was confusing to encounter, in the midst of these changes, the piercing, youthful quality of Bernard's gaze, that startling blue clarity, veering toward judgment, which Roman, feeling weary, now recognized as the extremity of innocence. Bernard, at 48, was as good as a stranger, but at the mere sight of him, Roman became aware of the compendium of his own life, organized by time, as if in separate rooms of a house, precious items left to gather dust along with the clutter of years. A door had closed, old possessions uncovered, a part of himself.
Thank you so much. So later in the novel, after the passage you read, Bernard tells Roman, "Poetry cannot be taught. All of this instruction of technique is merely superstition, magical thinking." And Roman responds defensively, "That's not true." So where do you come down on the question of whether creative writing can be taught?
Oh my God. Well, I said that I put everything I knew into the book, and one of the things I know is that there's a big question about this topic. Obviously, everything can be taught to a certain extent. I mean, I practice violin with my daughter, who's going on 7, she's going to be 7 soon. We spend a lot of time sort of marveling over how unintuitive the position of a violin player has to be. I mean, the things you have to do in order to play violin are odd. They're not what the human hands are designed to really do. She's learning it. She's slowly learning it. We're not trying very hard, I have to admit. I mean, we don't practice as much as we should, but she's sort of getting it, and she's starting to sort of instinctively grasp the violin after a fairly long period of time. But I think that everything is like that. I think if you do anything often enough, you could do it. For example, at one point in my life, I considered going to law school. I think I would suck at being a lawyer, but I'm sure that if I did it long enough, my brain would sort of work its way into thinking, I mean, more like a lawyer's brain. And yet, there's a point. So in other words, you can teach creative writing, but there's a point after which you can't teach creative writing. The person has to figure it out themselves, and you can't. You can give them advice about how to figure it out. People have all kinds of things, like go for long walks. That's one. Write in bed, write standing up, write, outside. I don't know. People have all these questions. This is the whole hocus pocus about process. Every time you see a major writer being interviewed, in public, someone will raise their hand and say, "Tell us about your process." And that's not because they actually want to know about that writer's process necessarily, except that they want to take something from that, see if it works for them. So it is hocus pocus. There's something you just can't get across, and some people can naturally write in a way that is infuriating to people who've taken longer to learn. Interestingly, the thing that sort of interests me about fiction writing, and I don't know if it's exactly true about poetry, so maybe I'm bluffing a little in the book, but the person who starts off being talented and being able to naturally sort of do everything they're supposed to do isn't necessarily the one who's going to be a writer, and is often somebody who puts writing aside at some point and doesn't return to it for a long time, maybe never. People who have to struggle and struggle and struggle often become professional writers. Why is that? Because the real thing that you need in order to be a writer is persistence. And if you have to struggle against sort of stupidity when you're starting out, it helps you develop this other thing that you need in order to be a writer.
So I will not ask you about your process, but what I will do is say, okay, given all you've said, you are a teacher of writing. Mm-hmm. You teach at one of the most prestigious, perhaps the most prestigious writing program.
Perhaps, I think it is.
How do you approach the challenge of teaching writing?
Well, we're very lucky in our program because the people who come to the program are committed. I mean, they're committed for 2 years, and that's a rare experience to have as a teacher. They're really serious. They've, in many cases, pulled up their homes and moved out to what they sometimes consider to be the middle of nowhere, and so they're ready to buckle down. You know, it's funny. When I'm thinking about it today, just on this particular day, I think that teaching students like this has something to do with both helping them redouble their efforts and focus and disarming them. Because I think people do their best work when they're not aware exactly of what they're doing. And sometimes when people put so much pressure on themselves and they come, you know, all the way to Iowa in order to become a writer, they can freeze up. And so I think that part of my teaching has to do with trying to unfreeze them up. It doesn't always work. I mean, I've said this before, but, you know, I have all these things that I think about, and craft techniques and books and, you know, procedures, but sometimes you just think that what you should really do in order to make them better is just feed them chicken soup. They need a lot of support.
They need a lot of support.
They do. They need support. They need to believe that what they're doing is worthwhile, and that it's worthwhile because they have a special way of seeing things, or that they have something to say, not necessarily the same thing, but...
So you don't sound exactly like Miranda Sturgis.
No, I'm not like Miranda at all. Actually, Miranda's based on other teachers that I've known.
We can leave it at that. No, it's clear
She's
that
a composite.
So we have 1 minute left. Here's my last question for you. Have you read anything recently that you'd recommend that has moved you, that you think is a great book?
Oh my God. You know, I'm preparing to give a series of sort of thoughts about various uses of time in fiction. And I've been reading the first short story in the book called The Immigrants by W.G. Sebald.
Mm-hmm.
And it's called Dr. Henry Selwyn. I mean, and I've only discovered Sebald in the last, say, 4 years, and I'm just astonished by how good he is. In fact, turning to one's own work after reading him is a very discouraging experience. It's extraordinary. The Immigrants is a really extraordinary book. Well, I mean, all of his books are.
Thank you so much for that recommendation. I hope that our viewers will go out and read him. Thanks so much for talking to us today.
It's a pleasure.
I've been speaking with the fiction writer Lan Samantha Chang, professor of English at the University of Iowa and director of the Iowa Writers' Workshop. Chang gave a lecture and a reading at the U of O on April 3rd and 4th, 2014. Her visit was part of the Comparative Literature Department's Nomad Mentorship Program. Thanks for watching.